Cars have come a long way since the first steam-powered vehicles hit the roads in the late 1700s. But what exactly has changed over the years? And how did we get from those early vehicles to the modern, high-tech cars we know today? Let's take a journey through the evolution of cars. The first steam-powered cars were invented in the late 1700s, but it wasn't until the 1820s that they began to be built on a larger scale. These early cars were incredibly heavy and slow, and often required a team of horses to pull them up hills. But they were a major step forward in transportation technology, and they paved the way for the gasoline-powered cars that would come later. The first gasoline-powered cars were invented in the late 1800s, and they quickly became popular because they were faster and more reliable than steam cars. But they were still quite primitive by today's standards. They had no suspension, no brakes, and no gears. They were also incredibly loud, and they smelled terrible because the gasoline was so impure. As cars became more popular, manufacturers began to add new features to make them more comfortable and more efficient. Cars from the early 1900s had better suspension, brakes, and gears, and they were also much quieter and cleaner than earlier models. But they were still quite basic by today's standards. They had no power steering, no power brakes, and no air conditioning. Cars from the 1920s and 1930s were much more advanced than earlier models. They had more luxurious interiors, and they also had more powerful engines. Some of the most iconic cars from this era were the Ford Model T, the Chevrolet Model A, and the Dodge Brothers car. The Ford Model T was the first car to be mass-produced. It was known as the car for the masses. This era also saw the invention of the assembly line, which made cars cheaper and more affordable for the average person. But despite these advancements, cars from this era were still quite primitive by today's standards. They had no automatic transmission, no power windows, and no power locks. The 1940s and 1950s were a time of great change for the car industry. Cars from this era had many new features that we take for granted today, such as automatic transmission, power windows, and power locks. They also had more powerful engines, and they were more aerodynamic than earlier models. Some of the most iconic cars from this era were the Chevrolet Bel Air, the Ford Thunderbird, and the Plymouth Fury. But despite these advancements, cars from this era were still quite primitive by today's standards. They had no airbags, no ABS brakes, and no electronic stability control. The 1960s and 1970s were a time of even more advancements in car technology. Cars from this era had many new features that we still use today, such as airbags, anti-lock brakes, and electronic stability control. They also had more powerful engines, and they were more aerodynamic than ever before. Cars from this era also had more luxurious interiors, with features like power seats and climate control. Some of the most iconic cars from this era were the Ford Mustang, the Chevrolet Camaro, and the Dodge Challenger. But despite these advancements, cars from this era were still not as fuel efficient as today's cars. The 1980s and 1990s saw further advancements in car technology, with the introduction of computerized systems, such as engine management systems, and more fuel-efficient engines. Cars from this era also had more advanced safety features, such as traction control and lane departure warning. And the introduction of cars like the Honda Civic and Toyota Corolla made compact cars more popular, and more efficient. But even with these advancements, cars were still not as environmentally friendly as they are today. And now, we have arrived at the present day, where cars have reached an unprecedented level of technology and efficiency. Electric cars have become more and more popular, and they are much more environmentally friendly than gasoline-powered cars. They have a smaller carbon footprint, and they don't produce harmful emissions. Some of the most popular electric cars on the market today are the Tesla Model S, the Nissan Leaf, and the Chevrolet Bolt. And with new technology like self-driving cars and connected cars, the future of cars is looking brighter and greener than ever before. From the first steam-powered vehicles to modern electric cars, cars have come a long way in terms of technology, design, and environmental impact. It's been a wild journey, and we can't wait to see what the future holds for the car industry. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the evolution of cars.